there's no pleasing anyone. On one side, you've got people saying, the state should never be intervening in the economy because it's very inefficient. And then suddenly you've got those same people saying, we just can't compete with China because the state is completely enmeshed with the economy. So which one is it? Is it the state is too efficient and therefore is going to outcompete us all, or the state is completely useless and can't compete at all with anyone? I'm sorry, a bit of a rant there, but I'm just sort of sick of this weird debate going on and on without actually reaching any conclusions. Mexico's just launched its new Plan México, which is Mexico's industrial policy for the next 5 years. It's pretty ambitious, but it's faced all this criticism. Can we make any actual sense of this, Tavo?
I completely agree with you. I mean, when you look at even the very rich, very successful capitalist countries, you see that historically the governments have heavily intervened, and even today, governments continue to have significant ownership and control of certain industry. Now, historically, for good economic reasons, that has tended to be focused on things that we call in economics natural monopolies, or also militarily strategic assets. So you have railways, energy, water. But then there's other stuff. I mean, if you look at DHL in Germany, that's primarily government owned and a very successful capitalist enterprise, Japanese tobacco in Japan. And then Switzerland, the poster child of success. When you look both at a federal and even a municipal level, all over the country, there's very, very significant government intervention. So why is it okay when the Swiss do it, but when Mexico does it, everyone's up in arms?
Let's be generous about the people who critique this approach and say there's nothing racial or xenophobic about that distinction. Maybe it's something to do with quote unquote economic culture or political culture. I think maybe there's something to historical contingency. What do I mean by that? I mean, sometimes the historical moment in which a country finds itself makes it more or less likely to succeed when it does intervene in the economy. So over the next few minutes, we'll be talking about Mexico's history of vigorous state intervention and how it's really worked sometimes and really catastrophically failed in other moments, just to start making sense as to whether or not, one, the Mexican economy can actually intervene successfully in its own economy, and two, whether or not it's likely to do so this time.
Let's go back in time. Let's go back to the time that in Mexico is known as the Mexican Miracle. This is a period between the 1940s, the early 1940s, and the late 1960s, in which Mexico grew under something that was called the import substitution model, which is an old idea with a new name. In essence, the idea was that the government should intervene to try to limit how much external competition there could be so that the country could develop certain key industries and thereby grow economically. In Mexico, it was specifically known as the Stabilizing Development Plan, Desarrollo Estabilizador. Now, very briefly put, it was incredibly successful. Over a period of 20-something years, the country grows at almost 7% a year. Per capita growth is at 3.5% a year. Inflation's below 3% every year. There's huge stability. And most importantly, quality of life increases significantly. So two key things that we see are health increases in all metrics. The Mexican population, which had been relatively stagnant for a very long time, more than doubles in this period. And then at a crime level, for example, homicides fall by over 90% in this period to match US levels by the end of the 1960s.
So what we're seeing here is massive, massive success. Can we reproduce it? You could argue that maybe we can't. Simply put, the world was a different place in the 1940s, 50s and 60s, and it all begins with the Second World War, a moment of enormous opportunity for a country like Mexico, which was completely isolated from the conflict beyond a few skirmishes in the high seas. But Mexico was fine. And at the same time, you had all these massive industrial powers either being bombed out or churning out a massive amount of arms to support the war effort. So suddenly we had a form of protectionism, we can call it organic protectionism, in which Mexico found its industries protected from competition from abroad. And suddenly you get this massive boom. A wonderful historian who I really love, Rosemary Thorpe, has covered this period and says the Second World War made Latin America industrialized because it forced industry upon it. It wasn't that it was a deliberate government plan, even though the government did guide the way industrialization took place. But the fact that it happened so aggressively was in large part thanks to the 1940s and 1950s being a moment of relatively unproductive industrial output from these Second World War countries. That takes us to the 1960s, which suddenly starts seeing Mexico face different sorts of pressures, which I think is fascinating. But I want to sort of jump into this very specific issue that lots of people are talking about, which is technology. So you can want to industrialize all you want, but if you don't have the right skills, you can't do it at all. And what I think is fascinating about this period is how the government tried and failed often with lots of different industries. And it was all contingent on the fact that they were able to master the technology. On one side, you've got this sort of beautiful little failure, which is the failure around pulque. Pulque being, of course, Mexico's answer to beer. It's made out of a cactus called maguey, where they ferment the liquids within it, and then you get this sort of lightly alcoholic, lightly fizzy, viscous drink, very, very popular up until the revolution. And then beer sort of overtook it, but the government wanted, probably out of national pride, to industrialize it and make it big again, make pulque great again. And so in the 1950s, they tried to do this, and you needed a lot of food science behind this, and they just couldn't manage it. It feels weird to think now, but they just couldn't manage to bottle and industrially produce pulque because the science simply wasn't there. They couldn't stop the fermentation process within the bottle without changing the taste, and so the bottles kept on exploding. And so beer just completely overtook pulque. And I think now we're seeing a bit of a revival, but it's sort of sad how over the next few decades, pulque disappeared, even despite heavy intervention from the state.
Yeah, and I think something that's key about this story is this is a very relatively, at least, niche consumer product. And in this, Mexico failed. However, the things in which it did really well over these 20 years are in the development of industries that are much more fundamental and which, as you're saying, Alex, the technology for them had been well developed over 100 years before, over 50 years before, and was widespread all over Europe and the US. So what Mexico succeeded in was bringing in these technologies and just implementing them, whereas something like pulque was a little bit more cutting edge.
Yeah, niche. And that's the key word here, technological transfer. The Plan México, the Claudia Sheinbaum plan we saw in the past few days released, basically makes a big deal out of technological transfer. And that's really how China got off the ground. A lot of people complain about Chinese IP theft, but really a lot of it was companies going to China and saying, great, you want to make stuff for cheap in China, you want to sell in China, you've got to train our Chinese scientists and engineers in the skills that you've brought with you. And that's what Mexico's trying to do. They've tried to do it with trains, with the Maya train in Yucatan, and they're trying to do it with energy. The Danish, I know, are very involved and are kindly, no one's had to steal anything here because the Danish are working with the Mexican National Electricity Company to transfer technologies to make Mexican electricity better. So we've got this push to transfer technologies as opposed to the previous government, which said, well, let's just bring in investment and then hopefully that people bring their technologies with them. But there was no sort of obligation to do so. And then when companies left, they said, well, you can't do it on your own, so bye.
Now, the clear question here is if bringing in technologies worked in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and it seems that that's what the new government is doing now, then what's the problem? And part of the answer comes from the fact that when the system that had been very successful up until the late 60s begins to show signs of being overheated, or at least more like coming to the end of what it could offer, the new president that comes in 1970, a man by the name of Luis Echeverria, he decides that it's time to change the way things are done in Mexico. It's just language, or it sounds like just language, but it's a very important change in language because he says we will no longer have a stabilizing development plan, no longer desarrollo estabilizador. We will now have a shared development plan, desarrollo compartido. And the focus here clearly was no longer on stability, but on distribution of wealth. Now, what did that translate to in actual policy? Well, the state became much more heavy-handed in the way it did things. It was no longer let's find things that work abroad and let's bring them in and protect things and fund them so that the industry develops. But there was a famous phrase of the economy is decided in the presidential palace or the presidential home. La economía se decide en los pinos. Because that's what happened. The president would just make unilateral decisions. And that came with a very heavy hand. It came with unbridled expense. So by the end of his presidency, the numbers are unclear, but what seems to be the most believable number is that the presidency ends up buying, or during his presidency, the country ends up buying over 600 companies. It goes from owning 86 companies to over 700 companies by the end of the presidency, in 6 years alone. Debt will triple. Inflation will grow from being at 3% and having been for 30 years at 3% to reaching 16%. And the key thing here is the government really wanted to own companies. It really wanted to be involved in the setting up of companies and pushing how companies were built and what kind of companies existed. And this came with three big issues. Well, above all, they failed. The big issues that we saw behind that failure was, one, colossal incompetence. There is the most famous case is a steel mill that they tried to build in Las Truchas, in a place called Las Truchas, which was never finished. Billions were spent. It was never finished. It was a complete catastrophe. Number two, it was an era of huge corruption and nepotism. Obviously, corruption had existed before, as it does everywhere, but it really started getting out of hand at this point. And number three, this focus on the social or the idea of something social over an economic element meant that the government would save or protect companies that should go under just because there was an idea that this would lead to some magical sharing of wealth.
Echeverria was a wonderful case in point for how industrial policy shouldn't happen. Now, what I think was interesting, you talk about colossal incompetence, you talk about corruption and nepotism, but actually quite successful countries do all that and still have very good state-owned companies. So what actually went wrong here? I think here even the industrial policy theory goes against what Echeverria did, because one of the key points of import substitution, where you stop importing stuff because you want to make it at home, is the fact that he forgot the last bit of the equation, which is exports. You need to export to keep your products competitive. If you trap everyone within your country with your state-owned companies and force them to buy your crappy products, well, people will begrudgingly buy expensive and low-quality products, but it sort of protects those industries unnecessarily. As you said, the companies that need to go under don't go under. And so suddenly you've got these very inefficient companies, these very, very sad stories of just terrible products at very, very high prices. And then suddenly you get these economic crises later on in the 20th century, where suddenly something's got to give and they've got to start selling the companies so that they can make them profitable. And that's the sort of big boom of neoliberalism. But before that, I thought we could sort of go into this case study, because I think this is fascinating, how Cancun is the perfect expression of how they went from efficient government planning to poor government planning to privatization, which is this colossal project in which they wanted to, the government in the 1960s and 70s wanted to make the most of the Cuban Revolution. And they said, perfect, these Americans aren't going to Cuba. So they invested heavily in the Mayan Riviera, because that's where they literally did these studies where they said this is where tourism is most likely to peak in Mexico, and they invested in the public infrastructure, in the hotels. They worked for years and years on this, and then eventually you got this enormous success story called Cancun, this great tourist destination synonymous with excess and luxury.
To that point, I think we need to remember that Cancun is not just an important tourism destination, it is one of the most important in the world. It has one of the largest tourism destination airports in the world. The volume that Cancun takes in is really world class. And this begins all with a government decision made in the presidential palace.
Exactly. To the extent that they wanted to show it off at one point. In 1981, you get this North-South conference in which Mexico had proposed that we bridge the divide between capitalism and communism and go the Mexican way, which is this state-led capitalist union where everyone can be happy together. Obviously, that's what happened, and colorín colorado, the end of the story. Hooray. Lovely talking to you, Tavo. Clearly not. Obviously not. It all went wrong, and Cancun became this sort of icon of over-the-top privatization and just the destruction of the jungles, very poor conditions for local workers, and recently big spikes in terrible criminal gangs in a place that usually doesn't actually have much violence at all. So you saw this steady decline into, we'll call it privatization, but also I call it the emptying of the state receding where it was very, very present once. And that leads us to your favorite part of the 20th century, Tavo, the 90s.
So what happens in the 90s is, as we mentioned last time, this is the coming in of the Washington Consensus. So the government that follows Luis Echeverria's government, we spoke about last time, 1976 to 82, López Portillo, ends up in tremendous crises. The government that follows that isn't very good at controlling things. Things are just not working in Mexico. So the president that comes in, Carlos Salinas, decides that he's going to follow the Washington Consensus, and that brings about massive reform. And one of the key reforms that we see is massive privatization. All these hundreds of companies that the government had bought over a very long period of time now need to be privatized. And we're talking all sorts of companies. So at the beginning, it was just electricity and oil and telephones, things that are widely owned by governments. But there were companies here that there was a pina colada syrup company that had to be sold off. Obviously, nobody bought it. But in the 90s, there are a lot of companies that are very successfully sold off. Why? Because they are cash cows. So the Mexican banks are privatized, telephone companies are privatized, railway lines are privatized. And we see in general a move towards a very reduced role of government. Okay, and what follows is something that will be a recurring theme in Mexico, and one that I think is at the heart of the problem that we see in Mexico today, which is two Mexicos begin to form. One which will benefit enormously from these reforms, there's no doubt about it, will benefit enormously from the growth that came from them, and therefore the people that belong to this group are to date heavily against government intervention. And there is one very large group, the majority of the country, which has not benefited that much from these reforms. In many cases, they've suffered quite a bit under them, with stagnant or even declining real wages, stagnant or declining quality of work, of workplace. And this group of people, not that they're necessarily pro-government intervention, but they are eager for a change. And that is part of what has brought in the new regime. Now, something to bear in mind here is why is it that they're not necessarily pro-government intervention? Because something that is clear since the 90s to date is that the companies that the government didn't sell off and kept under its control have widely a reputation for being all the things that we saw during the time of Echeverria, but now a rancid and long-standing version of it.
Some did benefit from the state's exit from the economy. I love the story of the sale of a pretty important company during its time under the state, and it just became unwieldy and massive. And it was called Telmex, the Mexican telephone company. It was around under the state since 1972 up until the year 1990, when it was bought by none other than Carlos Slim. He became the richest man in the world on the basis of that purchase. And just between 1995 and 2000, his fortune tripled and only kept growing through, of course, rent extraction and very, very high prices that had to be broken by the government years later after he'd milked the Mexican population dry on the basis of pretty bad service. So that sort of brought us all the way back to this argument, which is, so wait, wasn't privatization supposed to make services better and cheaper? We got the opposite. So what happened there? And so we get this rise of this opposition from the left that starts saying, actually, no, we need to start rolling back the privatization. We need to start recapturing these natural monopolies, rail, oil, etc. And it brings us to the rise of López Obrador. And yet, again, I want to underscore historical contingency. Had López Obrador won the first time he ran for office in the year 2006, he would have probably failed in his attempts to enter the economy, because in 2006, before the great crash of 2008, the world was against this whole idea that the state should get involved. This is the height of liberal ideology. It's the height of getting the government out of the economy. And massive pressures would have built up against López Obrador. The age of Trump and economic nationalism in the West has changed this, because suddenly we're seeing a lot more of an open doors policy to close doors by the state.
And I think something that's important here, it's not just that Mexico is copying the Trump rhetoric. It has its very own history that has nothing to do with what Mr. Trump says or stands by. That has led to the rise of people like López Obrador. And what is that? Well, basically in 2006, when López Obrador is running for office and loses, it's been only 6 years since the fall of the PRI, which controlled the country for 70 years. And there was a lot of hope in the country that this new democratic Mexico was going to fix all the problems, and we were going to go back to growing and while having fair and democratic institutions. But the problem is, all presidencies that follow from the year 2000 onwards fail to deliver on their promises. It seems to be a lot more of the same under a new name with new colors. But it's the same idea. And López Obrador really builds on that.
And so ultimately, you get this massive re-entry of the state. So you get the national oil and electricity companies becoming not only state-owned but state-run. You start getting massive projects run by the army, which has become very, very controversial. And you get a return to this narrative that, as you mentioned, sounds awfully a lot like Echeverría. But it's different. And I think this is where it's really crucial to talk about Claudia Sheinbaum's new Plan México, because she's taken it a step further from López Obrador, a far more technical approach to state intervention, far more business-friendly in the sense that they want public-private collaboration, but with the guidance, support, and subsidization by the state, which is crucial because they're going to target basically a dozen industries where they're going to be going all in. That's semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, energy, and manufacturing, and many others. And the government is going to get completely involved in this. So from going from basically just a regulator in the late 90s and early 2000s, the Mexican government is now saying to private business, we want to either be your partner or to compete with you. And that's a very big change. But the biggest change, as compared to the Echeverría years, is that exports are at the heart of this. All of these different industries are either strategic, so energy, right? You can't do anything without energy, but the rest are export-oriented. And that is a completely different story from what we saw under Echeverría, because crucially, it means that we're not going to be forced to buy terrible, terrible products, because if they're that bad, even if they've got tariffs put on any imports, people will still probably buy them if they're slightly more expensive, but actually much better to use, much more durable, much more efficient. So that combination of government support, a few tariffs which are sort of within WTO limits, and government support for private industry to grow, that feels like a much more sane approach to the economy, not this extreme where everything's privatized and the government is just a regulatory body, and not that other extreme where the government owns everything and you're not allowed to buy anything else.
Yeah, definitely. Now, what's tricky about this is that while it is a correction of the framework that is being followed, the question still stands. How is Mexico going to develop, and the Mexican government going to develop or participate realistically in things that are very complex? So if they'd said, baking products, that's one thing, but, semiconductors and pharmaceutical products aren't making cookies. So it's tricky to believe that the government, which has a long-standing reputation of not being very good at running companies or being involved in company administration, that suddenly they're going to be able to be very successful at the creation of these sectors that are highly technical, highly complex.
But it's the very constraints that make this such an interesting moment, because sure, we see the opportunities, and Mexico's great at squandering opportunities like nearshoring and all that, but actually it's the constraints that has made this an interesting plan for industrial development, because the austerity budget that Claudia Sheinbaum is working under has forced her to play nice with the private sector. The private sector's already playing nice because Morena, the party in power, rules everything. And this has sort of balanced out that relationship, which I think is more or less essential if you're going to get them to cough up their money. They need to feel they've got some leverage. So interestingly, the constraints within the budget may actually be Claudia Sheinbaum's best friend when it comes to approaching the private sector and driving this economic, industrial, state and private-led growth together.
The question that we end up with is, will the government avoid the pitfalls that we've seen in the past? Will it prioritize stability, or will it prioritize the redistribution of wealth? But that is, of course, the question that has plagued the Mexican government for the better part of 100 years. I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex González Ormerod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we'll be talking about Mexico, its history, economics, politics.
And why you, wherever you are in the world, are deeply affected by it every single day.
Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to subscribe there and give us a like, a comment, and all that good stuff that pleases the algorithmic gods. For now, toodle pip.
Till next time.